10 minutes late. Finished 10 minutes late.
Hello, welcome to this session on colonial development, Watchmen and water in Bihar under British rule. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Peter Robb to the podium. I've known Peter for some decades and I see him as some sort of a mentor in my studies on Bihar. His prolific publications, he has edited 10 books, and it was 9 monographs, 3 are about early Calcutta, and 4 wholly or partly on 19th and 20th century Bihar. He's currently working on a 19th century book, a book called Bihar, The British and Bihar, Development in a Colonial Society. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and former president of the Royal Asiatic Society. And he held a chair in the Center for South Asian Studies and was head of Department of History and pro-director at SOAS, the University of London. It's a pleasure to welcome him back to Bihar after 40 years, something like that. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Just an announcement that because we are running 10 minutes late, we will end the session at 7:40. He will speak for 35 minutes, and we will have 10 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Vinita, for those remarks. I feel that at this stage of the day, I should be offering the comic turn to relieve everybody's tiredness and pressure. I fear there aren't any jokes, but at least I'm going to move from the sublime and the serious to the not very important, but possibly quite interesting. And tangentially, I think what I'm going to say does actually reflect on these huge issues of policy making, of rights, of environment. But I stress tangentially. So I shall read the paper in the interest of speed, and if it goes on longer than 35 minutes, I shall try and be disciplined and be quiet. When the British ruled Bihar, they imposed regulations and enforced them sometimes, but often refrained from interference. In some ways, they presided over a minimal, ineffective state, arguing that Indians knew their own business best, letting private individuals and enterprises get on with it for good or ill. In other respects, they engaged in social engineering and tried to promote economic progress. They gathered data and invested in irrigation, infrastructure, and scientific research. However, the social and economic outcomes of those efforts were often poor. In Arvind Das's lament about Bihar, brutalized, he said, by scarcity and plenty, he complained that it was both exploited by imperialism and denied its benefits. Development policies were supposed to improve conditions, but also were intended to secure state income, promote trade, help co-opt powerful allies, and reduce popular unrest. In these ways, colonial priorities and practice were not very different from those of other governments to the present day. But development policies also reflect individual passions and contemporary understandings. They had particular characteristics in colonial India, and partly for that reason, official interventions often conflicted with indigenous structures and conditions. In Bihar, by the end of the 19th century, major changes were occurring in social and economic relations, commercial cropping, and trade. But rhetorically and in practice, British endeavours had come up against India. This paper seeks to cast some light on what worked, that is, promoted beneficial changes, and what did not work. Sorry? Is this mic not working? Oh, okay. I could stand up there. Oops. I'll stand up there. Is that better? Oh. Too much better. Is that all right now? Yes. In Bihar, by the end of the 19th century, I was saying there were major changes, but the I'm going to discuss what the British did that worked and what didn't and why. Today I'm going to be discussing the bureaucracy of development. I shall outline just 3 examples, or if time runs short, only 2, that had their origins in prevailing British ideas. For further information on them, I refer you in particular to Anand Jang's Limited Raj and Christopher Hill's equally well-named River of Sorrow. My first example concerns local agency. Centred on Watchmen and local taxation in Bengal Presidency, it illustrates some of the means whereby the state sought to incorporate local people in political action and some of the changing roles expected of government. The real starting point for the story is an initial moment of contraction and disengagement, best illustrated in the case of the Kanungos. These so-called expounders of the law were revenue officials and record keepers instituted from earlier equivalents in the time of Akbar, but paid mainly in land grants and therefore long regarded as hereditary. The East India Company's inclination was to distrust and disempower them. Their obvious replacement, I think I am going to move because every time I look down I lose the mic, yes. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Can we have these ones on?
Yeah.
Right, better. The East India Company's inclination was to distrust and disempower them. Their obvious replacement would be a salaried employee, but in the 1770s and 1780s, the company had barely reached that stage, even for its own European servants, let alone the army of functionaries needed to govern Bengal. A little later, the company decided its own information was improving, no thanks to the Kanungos, and they were accordingly abolished in a regulation of July 1793. Anand Jang calls the resulting system a bargain with local allies, limiting direct British involvement by supporting indigenous power. In Bengal, government then became almost wholly bereft of local informants, beyond a mistrusted police force whose most local agent was the Daroga, responsible for about 20 miles on average under the control of district magistrates. Indirect rule of that kind was poorly suited to a state with a development agenda. In the later stages of the 19th century, the British tried harder to build collective institutions in the countryside. With some desperation, they tried to remedy agrarian ills and make allies of better-off peasants. Local knowledge and local taxation came to be thought vital for good governance. Data were needed in the ordinary course of things concerning the state of crops, local prices, stocks of grain, and also to ensure advance warning of famines. Appeals were made from time to time to a whole army of travelling officials and allies. But after legislation in 1856, the village chowkidar were supposedly brought into play. In their neighbourhood posts, they became a lonely and necessary link with the people, reporting on economic and social conditions as well as crime. A proper local agency needed manpower, management and money. It was notorious that chowkidars were irregularly paid. Some thought them sufficiently accurate to keep the superior officers apprised of the general state of affairs, but the majority opinion was that they could not be relied upon because they were in such a hopeless state of poverty. Partly to meet the funding problems, a Bengal Act of 1870 envisaged that local communities would pay for their chowkidars. In 1885, the Local Self-Government Act authorised union panchayats to be set up to provide for local administration, including police. None of these were then introduced, but in 1892, the 1870 Act was amended to place chowkidars directly under the district magistrates, who would also set the rates of pay. Money would come from yearly assessment imposed and collected by local panchayats of 3 to 5 residents appointed by the magistrates. A suggestion that the panchayat should be elected was resisted on the argument that elections were foreign to India. It was intended that local resources should be mobilised to improve the chowkidars as the government's eyes and ears in rural locations. In Bihar, there was a range of opinions about this. Some thought it was not going to work. Some thought that the chowkidars had already been given sufficient pay and no improvement had been possible. Some thought that as long as the government retained a police of the people, their usefulness would be extremely limited. Basically, there was a fear that it would be impossible to make people pay for a system that would also be effective. So opinion was divided and the measures were half-hearted. In the 1890s, Bengal still lagged behind other provinces. The provincial government, alarmed by the Zamindari lobby, opposed extra local taxation. It looked with terror, it was said, at proposals for intervention. Influential Indians had objected to local cesses for 50 years or more. Nor did Bengal's rulers generally trust committees to spend any funds if they were made up of Indians. Nonetheless, in the mid-1890s, Indian newspapers such as the Statesman and Bengali were demanding that district boards be financed more liberally by the government. And in 1896, there was a renewed commotion over that crying want of rural India, supplies of clean water. The Bengal government, now under Sir Alexander Mackenzie, proposed to make over to the boards the provincial ferry fund receipts and to permit them to levy local taxes and tolls. The central government welcomed the scheme, thought designed to enable the people to do what they could themselves if they but chose to do so. Some on the Viceroy's Council thought that Bengal's previous caution had been circular and self-defeating. Local committees seemed useless, they said, only because they had so little money to spend and so few responsibilities. These senior officials wanted to create public action by Indians. And one of them said, "What are you to do in a country where a whole village will rather drink and cook with stagnant water than combine to dig a simple well?" Mackenzie was saying, he suggested, "Don't call on government to do what you ought to do yourselves. I offer you a means of combining for these common purposes." The liberally minded Henry Cotton, then chair of a police reform committee, thought it desirable that people should be familiarised with the idea that before long some scheme of additional local taxation is inevitable, though others still shied away from this idea. A watered-down version of Mackenzie's scheme was eventually introduced from 1903 as an amendment of the Bengal Local Government Act. The gains were small, the changes in attitudes slow and incremental, but the difference from the 18th century was nonetheless telling. The aim now was greater involvement, to tap funds for a development and to help generate a sense of public responsibility. Why? I think the improvements sought in local government were not really directed at perceived problems for the rulers. They were desired mostly because of an idea of what government should do. The deep arguments were about states' duties, which links to the previous paper, to provide policing, protect health, promote development, and so on. The list may seem axiomatic today, but it is never constant, and it was far from entrenched anywhere in the 19th century, let alone in British India. In the case of Chaukidari reform, there was, of course, law breaking in the countryside. There were even instances in which the interests of Europeans and colonial trade could be said to have been imperiled. But it was not the statistics of crime, but the general requirements of governance that were advanced in supporting arguments in the departmental notes that devised and advocated the reforms. They were intended to promote professionalisation as well as to raise taxes. Indeed, it was the improvement that required the money. The idea was to enlist local government and popular agency to help improve social and economic conditions. But the preferred means owed little to an assessment of Indian norms and potential, and a great deal to the corporate and municipal philanthropy that had emerged in Victorian Britain. At least as an ideal, this had the intention of reducing the extremes of deprivation and exploitation that accompanied the Industrial Revolution. Measures to improve housing, education, public health, conditions of labour, for example. In this spirit, as I've argued elsewhere, some Indian officials called for administration on the English model. Rich, public-spirited Indians were appointed to legislative councils. Local self-government was tentatively extended, just as codes of conduct were encouraged for indigo planters in Bihar in the hope of curbing their excesses. Of course, such initiatives did build public institutions and change attitudes to India. I've argued elsewhere that they're behind a discourse of rights. The effects are very apparent today. I question, however, whether they were effective in mobilising local support for government-backed improvements In many policy discussions among officials, there was talk of respect for indigenous custom, but the files on local agency made virtually no reference to utilising local expectations and practices. The 1903 Police Commission preferred village agencies to low-paid subordinate police, but only limited attempts were made to co-opt existing social power on its own terms. This was also true of development projects and their management. Indians who followed European ways too closely were suspect. And even when activists tried to promote reform, as in Britain, they were not trusted. Moreover, the relevant personnel were expected to be remade in line with British priorities and assumptions. A development agenda was to be sold to Indians by reforming them. As a strategy, it had obvious limitations, as much as when today's aid agencies impose their own goals and methods on those they seek to assist. Albert Hirschman, for example, at the World Bank from the 1950s, expressed strong doubts about the efficacy of remedies devised in Europe and North America and imposed with little consultation or adjustment on very different societies. So I've been discussing a disparity between knowledge of India and the remedies being applied to it, and I argued that the British in Bengal had almost no local agency for information and intervention. They tried to reform the chowkidars and to raise taxes to pay for them, but did not really trust Indians or Indian ways to achieve improvements. That left the field open for experts, bringing us to another set of problems and to my second case study. It concerns village irrigation, taking just one example among many I could discuss, and describes a conflict within government, the revenue officer versus the irrigation engineer. Here, disagreement over goals and methods between government departments and types of enterprise stand for different development strategies. In the 1880s, George Grierson, the collector in Gaya, considered several government estates to be badly in need of irrigation. As discussed many years ago by Nirmal Sen Gupta, Gaya's crops were irrigated in the main from small embanked reservations called ahas, fed from floodwaters through channels known as pines. This irrigated cultivation in Gaya was an excellent example of a surviving rent-based production system. The upkeep of these works was the chief responsibility of Gaya zamindars and supposedly justified the large share of the crops that they enjoyed under the prevailing produce-sharing tenure. Higher and variable rents remunerated the landlords and ensured that they maintained the water supply. Their earth-moving, as it was called, was capital investment in a technical sense, richly rewarded. But in large part, the capital comprised social prestige and organisation needed to enlist an unpaid or low-paid labour force and to make and enforce agreements between villages and so on. In his capacity as zamindar of the government estates, Grierson proposed constructing a pine to link one village, Sarawan, with the Leelajan River. He estimated the cost to government at 15,000 rupees. To gain approval for such expenditure, he had to apply to the Commission of Patna Division, who had to approach the Board of Revenue to solicit the sanction of the Government of Bengal, which first would consult the Public Works Department, which in turn would call for a report from Grierson's neighbour in Ara, the superintendent engineer of the Soane Circle. Grierson and his successor presented various such proposals, and in 1891 the Bengal secretary allowed himself the sneer of referring to one of them as yet another of Grierson's schemes. The Public Works Department was that financially it would certainly be preferable to make any reduction in rent than to carry out the works proposed. It's easy to see why. One of Grierson's plans, for example, proposed in 1888, was reported on by Odling, then superintending engineer, in September 1891. Odling decided that 2 canals would be needed, one 15 miles long, the other 10. The area irrigated would be about 33,000 acres. He estimated the cost as not far short of 4 lakhs plus recurring expenditure about 3,000 rupees a year. If this were regarded as a productive, that's a commercial scheme, then a water rate of 13 rupees per acre would be needed to give a sufficient return. The usual rate in the area was 2 to 3 rupees. He concluded that from a commercial point of view, the scheme has from the first been reported to be hopeless. No person interested in laying out his money to advantage would dream of undertaking it. The only thing to be said for it was it would give employment on earthworks for 8,000 to 10,000 people for 6 months in the event of famine. On this occasion, Grierson had estimated the cost at 23,000 rupees with benefits over a large acreage, and he responded vigorously, pointing out he'd not asked for a canal but for a pine, and these irrigation canals in Gaya obviously did pay, as they were everywhere constructed by private enterprise. And if we examine Odling's estimate in detail, we can see why. I will spare you those, but believe me, his calculations were in every respect an order of magnitude above what Grierson anticipated, particularly on the cost of superintendents, management and labour, none of which would have had any cost at all locally. The irrigation expert had spoken, however, and the matter lingered on in the files until reopened from the district in 1896. By now, the maximum cost was thought to be 44,000 rupees in the view of the revenue officers. And there was a great further discussion about whether they would be better informed on these matters than the engineers of the Public Work Department. And Grierson particularly answered, and this was perhaps the telling argument, that the government's share of the crop on the irrigated land would be increased by 50%, which represented about 4,000 rupees or 9% on the outlay that would be required. And the superintending engineer finally was R.B. Buckley, replied and said he criticised many of the arbitrary cuts that they'd made. He wasn't entirely sympathetic. He knew that some of these cut works could work. But if the government was involved, then they would need to have all these additional complications and provisions because otherwise people would complain. It's probably true that the government in its capacity as government would run into objections if it built things, and I'll come to this in a moment, which interfered with people or indeed came into contact too greatly with them. Eventually, however, he withdrew his opposition, understanding that the works would be private, and the board then said, okay, you can, the objections are unanswerable, but you can do it if you wish, but we haven't got any money just yet, but when we have you, we will. There's a clear illustration here of the difficulty faced by large bureaucracies in adapting general rules to specific conditions. Also significant is the distinction between public and private, which is sharper because it was also between foreign and indigenous. Public investment in Gaya's irrigation was becoming more necessary at this time, not only on government estates, but because private efforts were under threat and in decline. But one lesson from this case is that the government was too large and too slow to be very effective as a force for improvement, even when it had diagnosed a need and had some idea of the remedy. And similar disabilities, I argue, were found more generally in official development efforts. Firstly, the public works engineers primarily responsible for improvements in irrigation were likely to be limited by the ideas of their profession, in particular to be ill-equipped to assess small-scale projects and prejudiced against culture remedies. Thus, Buckley could admit the virtues of this form of irrigation, but argue against government intervention. He similarly investigated an embankment across a river in Shahabad and thought it was much more efficient than a permanent weir because it disappeared at each harvest, but nothing that, this was not at all something that the government could do itself. So the possible effect of this and of the irrigation officer's intrinsic shortcomings was to deprive the country of government assistance on the very projects that were likely to be most useful. Secondly, it's apparent that government effectiveness was seriously impaired by another feature of modernisation, the division of responsibility between departments. The Gaya collectors argued that the pine was necessary to rescue the tenants from their chronic poverty. And while officials talked, people were deserting their lands. They could not afford to dam with faint praise, a system which secures daily food for more than 1 million people. The crucial question then for the engineers was what should be done instead of the schemes they criticised. And similar things could be said about large-scale government irrigation in this period in Bihar. They certainly improved local conditions and productivity in some senses, but there were well-known problems with canal waters, and above all, they were set at a rate which was designed to produce a commercial return. By contrast, local people, including a sugar factory owner called Ernest Mill, were desperately trying to persuade the government to make an outlay in irrigation in his district because, he said, the failure of either rice or rabi, not infrequently both, is a normal condition so that people live perilously close to want, unable to borrow for lack of security, and therefore had a strong claim on government for assistance. Often then, the debate was thus between rival schools of political economy, rival ideas about what government was for. Government who rejected these schemes should suggest, so said Mill, an alternative protection against famine. But that imperative, of course, was never part of the engineer's brief. I think I've got just about some time to move on to give you a taste of my third example, which concerns embankments. The damage caused by overmuch water in North Bihar. There are going to be some other papers on that subject in this conference. In the final analysis, this reflected colonial priorities of trade and order, but it was also a reaction to the increase in population and to the subject people's greater marginality and exposure to risk. The panoply of problems and reactions may be judged from Chris Hill's study of the Kosi River in Purnia. There are some parallels also with the litany of decline in the Sundarbans, partly attributed to official errors by Iftikhar Iqbal. From my account, it will be seen that state intervention became an issue because the nature of the problem changed, and because Indians, as well as indigo factories, demanded action. The embankments again illustrate a major theme of this paper, the extent to which British measures were inherently unsuited to providing solutions to the problems which the Indian people faced. I'm not now concerned with Hill's assessment of the disaster of officially encouraged settlement on riverine lands, but agree that what he called ecological paternalism failed because it did not adapt to local conditions. As pressure on land increased at the end of the 19th century, agriculture became more intensive in low-lying areas of North Bihar, which were liable to be flooded. Accordingly, the government was asked repeatedly to build embankments to protect these areas in order to increase productivity and improve conditions of life. It became involved either directly by proclaiming all or part of a river under the Embankment Acts, which usually meant taking over total responsibility, or by the piecemeal carrying out of maintenance of works, mainly paid for by the zamindars who benefit. Neither flooding nor embankment was necessarily an unmixed disaster or boon. The upper levels of floodwater carried fine silt, which if an embankment were overtopped would greatly benefit the soil. The lower level carried sand, which if the embankment were breached would ruin the crops. Runoff was very important. A flood lasting 2 or 3 days was quite likely to result in a good crop, but one that remained for a long period, with the water unable to escape, would often mean no crop at all. Embankments usually protected one area at the expense of another, and though the advantages might well outweigh the disadvantages while the embankment held, the reverse would be true if the embankment was breached. By the 1890s, more serious and long-term disadvantages also were exercising official minds. The problem was not just worsening the floods lower down. It was particularly worrying tendencies for flooding rivers to deposit silt in the shallow portion between their banks and the embankments, raising the level and thus reducing the available waterway until it no longer contained the floods. The embankments would then have to be built up until eventually they would reach a dangerous height. In general, it was believed that successful embankments would give immediate relief to vulnerable areas but have incalculable long effects. I then discuss in this paper, which I'm not going to go into, a series of petitions from various people, usually contradictory, about embankments or removing embankments or doing one thing or another. The officials generally thought they should maintain the status quo, but that was not an easy task because the status quo was already being changed by what they were doing and by what people were doing, and indeed by the underlying environmental conditions. Two other principles may be discerned as well. there was a great reluctance to entertain projects for new embankments, but an equal reluctance to override interests that had already grown up around existing bonds. So they were generally ready to condemn this or that embankment as a mistake, but generally unwilling to do anything about it. And this greatly limited the possibility of the government of doing anything useful by way of intervention. What's more, their even-handedness was not even-handed at all. Because they were respecting the status quo, they were biased, and also because building an embankment for clear benefit was better or easier to understand than not building it because of possible long-term consequences. They definitely benefited and protected certain interests against others. And they did this collectively. Here's an example. There was an embankment breached by some villagers which caused considerable damage to crops. They were trying to save their own. These people, or a group of them, were taken to court. And the magistrate found that they were guilty. The total assets of these people amounted to about 5,000 rupees. And the magistrate said, well, it's rather hard to sell them up and ruin them completely, but still harder that the innocent persons should have to pay. There was a suggestion, actually, that they trawled the net widely enough they could find some rich people who had benefited whether or not they'd had anything to do with breaching the embankment. And yet, this notion of innocent persons is an interesting one. What it meant was that those who had previously benefited from the embankment were innocent, and those who had suffered from it were guilty. This is not even-handedness. It didn't work very well simply because also the government's attitudes were inconsistent. As the engineer Buckley remarked, we like nibbling at the matter and trying first here and then there how far we can go without raising the general question. The problem was, of course, you could win favour by building an embankment, but you then caused damage to other people. What's more, the government itself was changing the situation. As is well known, all those public works, roads, railways, canals, disrupted natural drainage. They did so supposedly in the public interest, but an even-handed approach was impossible. In many cases, because the roads or the canals or the railway embankments cut across the water lines, the only possible way of having no effect was to have a completely open waterway underneath them, which was impossible. Moreover, once they'd been built, all sorts of interests would grow up around them, and if you then began to put in culverts under the railways, you were running the risk of benefiting some people and denying other people. And finally, the project wasn't a static one. Not just because of the increasing cultivation of the areas affected. More water could enter North Bihar from Nepal than could be delivered across the plains. I won't go into the details, but the discrepancy is enormous. Just to give the section of the rivers on the Bagmati is 18,000 square feet at the border, and the section is less than 5,000 square feet further down, about 40 miles down the valley. So the idea that you could avoid flooding simply on these grounds by embankment was very dubious and extreme. Some people said, well, it's not really this basic thing, it's just that more people are living in this area. Whichever example is correct, a remedy was obviously necessary if land were to continue to be brought under cultivation. But no long-term relaxation in the freshwater population could be expected. And yet, it was argued, to embank these rivers without more knowledge than we possess at present is to tamper with one of the great forces of nature, and we cannot tell the ultimate results. The people, this advisor said, should adjust their arrangements to the facts, namely that the area had been subject to floods time immemorial. So here was a case where the government, in fact, was deciding it had no remedy, it could not act, even though it recognized the problem. This is not a conflict, as in Gaia, between goals and types of expertise, nor even a refusal to intervene on doctrinal grounds, as with limited Raj or laissez-faire. It had more in common with the failure over the chowkidars and local taxation. Western-style embankment policy, as it existed in 1890, had no answer to the worsening circumstances it faced. What was true even when the circumstances were part of the government's own making was also true in a wider perspective. The engineers, those apparently modernising agents, had no confidence in their ability to manage the environment. Perhaps nature and India were simply too big and complex for all the stereotypes of the Victorians' technological confidence. It was, after all, a triumph of the Indian environment over the reformist West. I've discussed these conflicts between the imperial and the local, the large scale and the small, one relating to system, local agency, and the others to knowledge, engineering, science and technology versus indigenous irrigation or environmental realities. They're tiny studies with large implications I can't pursue fully on this occasion. In regard to agricultural production, for example, it mattered that Indian and British conditions were so different and that the means of improvement were so often imagined along British lines. A well-informed and ambitious owner, occupier or manager was in the minds of most agricultural experts and officials as they sought improvements in India. He was a character often seen in official policy towards landed property, revenue and tenant rights, partly because they too were geared to agricultural development. He was hard to find in Bihar, perhaps in India. But for the British officials and experts, he had to be found, as the country was thought to be in peril, and with it, the British pretensions to a benevolent empire. By the later 19th century, the lesson of famines in particular was thought to be that the population was growing well ahead of agricultural productivity, and that the outcome would be a Malthusian crisis. Britain's agriculture had supposedly answered its growing need for food. Hence, India's landholding needed to become more like that of England. And then, with support and scientific investigation, India's agriculture too would develop. The price may be yet greater inequality as in England, but it was a price that needed to be paid, even paradoxically, by the poor. So India has to be considered, because of this kind of idea, against the backdrop of England, because it was England that provided the proposed remedies. The engineers' frustrations over embankments were one of many indications that India would not, or could not, meekly fall into line. Problems with local irrigation or local agency revealed intrinsic contradictions between Western remedies and Indian circumstances. Even for observers who understood perfectly well that Indian conditions were very different, England's revolution represented the future that India needed. What is more, some Indians were complicit. Enthusiastic high-status individuals formed agricultural societies and published journals or established fairs to espouse modern techniques and products. Most of this closely matched government efforts, many of which were, anyway, conducted by Indians. This may remind us that in the end, these stories are not really about imperialism, they're about the travails of modernization. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for keeping to time. An extremely wide-ranging paper, drawing on Yang's Limited Raj and Christopher Hill's River of Sorrow. Just while we pick up some questions, it's just I immediately sort of was interested in it's not the sort of calculations that the British were making at this time. It's not about science and technology or the environment meeting their technological sort of ideas of that time. Could it be that they were worried about who was going to pay for this? And in some senses, British taxation policy, I think, is an area which people have researched on. I mean, in many ways, this was a sort of state which was a very aggrandizing state, and followed on from the East India Company. This was a state which, in 1770, for example, in 1770 increased its taxation by 25 lakhs in a year when there were 10 million people who died of famine. And the fact that they are wondering about what to put into place in 1897, which is another year of famine, I think, is quite interesting. So I think the calculations there are very much monetary. Who is going to pay for this? And I think I would be quite interested to see how British taxation policies, say, compared in India to what was happening in Britain or China at this time. So that would be very interesting in terms of their hydrological sort of investments or the hydraulic societies they were trying to create. And they did, when they did want to create it, for example, the Sutlej Valley project in 1920s in Pawalpur, they made the Pawalpur state pay quite a large cost of it. And of course, again, the water rates were high and commercial agriculture was their prime motive. So I open it up to questions, but I would like some comments on that as well.
Well, so I just say straight away, I've written myself about the importance of financial restrictions and taxation policy, and in a sense, my local agency story is about that. It's how on earth do we find the money to do something we think we want to do? And the story of British rule is on one hand of aggrandizement, but on the other hand of how on earth do we find the money to find the things we want to do, and also prioritizing. If you look at the budgets, the priorities for the positive things that they might have been doing are always tiny compared with the other charges, the military in particular. This relates to a theory about the state. I'm a firm believer that there's endless evidence that economies grow when states get involved. Does anybody doubt this? Apparently there are some neoliberals out there who think it's not true, but they are people who have no regard to the evidence anywhere. And one of the problems in India was the state talked about investing, but it never really did. Of course there's sums of money and railways and all these other things, but compared with what it might have done, had it really harnessed resources, it was very, very small. So I don't dissent from any of that at all. I'm just saying there are also some ideological and practical impediments as well.
We'll pick up three or four questions, but if you could identify yourself as well, please, that would be.
I have a question. I'm Stephen Biggs, and associated with SOAS, and have worked in the COSI command area for 45 years ago. My question is, the engineering profession, which you've studied...
So yours has gone off somehow.
Mine on? Can you hear me? Hear me? Can you hear me? All right. Now, can you hear? My question is about engineers and the engineering profession, because some of the stories you're saying now relate to the cultures of engineering, applied engineering, mechanical engineering, or chemical engineering profession today, and have been played out in India, Bangladesh, Nepal. It's too simplistic to say that engineers are just educated to do the bidding of the state. Now, my question is, why within the engineering profession there is not reference to the empirical reality of the problems they've been asked to address? Because empirically, you don't have to be an engineer to realize that dropping silt within the embankments is leading to a disaster waiting to come. But apparently, professional engineers at the time went along with all of that. Unless you can tell us about within the engineering profession, there is an active protest, kind of alternative engineering profession. From my experience, I haven't come across that group yet.
Yeah.
I was only going to raise a question. You were discussing that. Was the problem of finance the problem of competing demands within the Indian budget, and therefore the need to raise extra taxation? Because there was no question of the British paying for anything in India, because the Indians paid for everything. Or have I been wrongly thought of and there was never a drain when drain was reversed? The British were paying for Indians.
Yeah, Sangeeta.
I'm Sangeeta Dasgupta. Thanks for a very interesting paper. But I was wondering about the larger point that you're making about colonial policy and overarching colonial policy. Because within the paper you do talk about conflicts within departments. You refer to debates that are taking place between colonial officials as well. So where is this accommodated? Is this not accommodated? Don't you have changing policies in response to these debates? I was just wondering how you would respond to that.
Shall I take this? Stephen first. Yes, I have not investigated the culture of the engineers. I mean, Buckley, for example, is well known for his writings, which I've seen. I think it was partly a question of what they saw as their brief. And they had, as far as when they were responding to a scheme from government, they had a set of expectations. And the expectations were set by central policy, which that these big works were supposed to have, unless they were famine-related, they were supposed to have a productive commercial basis. And so they applied that. I do think there was a mindset as far as the irrigation channels was concerned, which inhibited them from seeing small scale and understanding small scale. And I think that's persisted. I think one sees this in the preference for large dams over wells. One sees it in the preference in many areas for canals over wells. And there isn't a clear-cut assessment about the alternatives. And there wasn't in their brief. I'm sure there were individuals who as in my case actually, things I didn't have time to quote, there were plenty of people who said, I see the problem. As far as North Bihar is concerned, it wasn't that they didn't see the problem of silting. They were acutely aware of it, and there the problem was political. How on earth do we cope with individuals building embankments? Shall we forbid them? If an indigo factory builds an embankment, should they be penalised because it's benefiting them and their villagers? Should we, if we intervene, does that mean we have to control the whole river? Do we really want to do that? These are political rather than engineering questions. And the backdrop to it was a keen recognition by the engineers of the nature of the serious problem that they were facing, to which I think they said, frankly, actually, we can't answer this. There was one scheme that said, well, the only way to deal with this particular problem was the Bagmati or one of the big rivers. The only way is to run 3 new channels across the plains. That's clearly impossible. And anyway, if we did do it, the problems on the River Ganges would be catastrophic. So it was a sense that they were, in spite of their alleged confidence, they felt defeated by this particular problem. So I think I wouldn't like to comment broadly on the culture of engineers in the late 19th century, or indeed the 20th century, yes. I'm perfectly prepared to believe that there are small areas of expertise which protect their own knowledge fiercely. It's a familiar phenomenon, and engineers no doubt any different from anyone else. Magnite, yes, Indians of course did pay, but this was a non-representative government, and there were great sensitivities about Indians paying more. Because you were trying to keep them sweet. And particularly we were trying to keep rich and influential Indians sweet. So if you'd had, in fact, people wrote this, and it was one of the arguments about having an independence. As you know, that if only Indians were in charge of their own destiny, they would be prepared to spend more on these developmental projects. Whether that aim has been fulfilled or not is a matter of debate. They certainly have spent more, but whether they spent as much as they could is another issue. So it's certainly true. Why were they worried financially? Yes, it was a matter of priorities, but it was also a matter of absolutes. If they could have taxed more, they would have. And they were constantly looking around for indirect taxations, court charges, tolls, market share. They're constantly looking around for these little things to bolster up and hypothecate particular things like this Chowkidari tax. And attempts in the 20th century to do the same. They constantly ran into big opposition, and opposition was not something they were seeking to court. Sangeeta, I've written down responsive policy. The questions I'm getting to see now, the questions completely gone out of my... Where has she gone? Yes.
So do you want to repeat your question?
Just give me a speed. You asked about...
I was asking, there seems to be an overarching colonial policy that you're talking about. And yet there are debates, there are discussions.
Yes.
So how is that accommodated within this larger ambit? And whether you perceive changes and a reflection of this?
I mean, in half an hour, you paint with a broad brush. I have, from my very first work, have emphasised debates and disagreements and evolution policy within the administration. So I don't deny that for a moment. I do think, however, that there are some underlying mindsets and expectations which partly relate to theories of political economy, they partly relate to the people they were reading, the influential figures, the thinkers. I mean, India and India questions, particularly social questions, were hot subjects in the late 19th century in Europe. And these people created a set of knowledges which it was very, very difficult for people in India to escape, the officials. Now, there was a spectrum. There were people who believed Indians were totally incapable and should be treated like children. And there were people on the other end that said, don't be ridiculous, these are incredibly sophisticated people, you have to bring them along with you, and they will show you lots of things that you didn't know. Within that spectrum, however, there's still a kind of barrier around it. And what I see here in terms of development thinking is that there is a barrier which is, broadly speaking, might be called the scientific stroke English-British paradigm. That there's a way you do things. How do you have local government? Oh, you have local self-government, you have boards, you have councils. They'd have had parish committees if they could. What was the Panchayati movement about? An attempt to create parishes. So that was constantly, but Indians were terribly, they didn't fit this. They had all these divisions, they had these other interests, they had caste, they had religion. How do we, it's not a homogeneous place. How do we corral them into this? But also, they had lots and lots of individual ways of doing things and understanding, which were not accommodated by that mindset, in spite of many sympathetic, knowledgeable, well-informed people among officialdom who understood exactly these nuances. There was something about moving the big machine. I'm not saying the machine didn't move, because of course it did. As I said, in the 18th century and in the early 19th century, it was trying to have a minimal government in Bengal, and then it was trying to have an interfering, socially interventionist government. It didn't succeed for various reasons. But one of the reasons was this, what I would call the English paradigm.
So I think if there are no more questions, I think we should... But yeah, the last one I think we'll take.
You've got a couple there.
Well, it's a very interesting presentation. I have one particular comment. I could not like your last comment that between modernization and the modernization that was done by the British colonial engineers in Kaveri Krishna were great success. In fact, without modernization that would not have been possible. And what I generally argue that there is essentially no difference between tradition and modern. Agriculture was traditional, agriculture is now modern. The argument essentially I got The reason was the Rayadari settlement. I don't go into the details, but in your book there is a crux. In Jamindari settlement, they had no reason to learn what is happening here. In Rayadari, they had every details. So Arthur Cotton actually argued that we develop on the principle, but we keep the modern technology. And there was an engineers' debate also, because William Wilcox in 1930s was leading that 100 years debate. The Calcutta University ultimately invited him to give a 3-series lecture which was published rather as a book. And for some time the orientation was changed. And many of these points you brought, but I don't think we have to be unkind to modernization. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Luisa Cortesi from Yale University. I too work on floods and water in North Bihar, although only for a decade as compared to many of you. So my question was if you could comment a little on the nature of the problem of floods seen through the British ruler's eyes. So I was wondering whether basically floods were seen as a problem univocally, or whether that was a little more controversial.
I didn't catch what you said. Say that again.
If you could comment on the nature of the problem of floods, whether floods through the British ruler side, so whether floods were seen as a problem univocally, was that or was it more controversial? Was flood considered a problem in your data, in your material, by everybody? So you say that they recognized the problem, but they didn't necessarily have a solution. There was no debate about it.
Yes. I'll just take that one first. Yes, there was indeed much debate about it. Broadly speaking, floods were regarded as a problem. And as I said, there were certain short-lived floods which were not. But they were definitely trying to see if there were ways in which they could respond to all the local appeals that they do something about floods. And as I say, they broadly decided that they would do as little as possible. Actually, they did eventually proclaim one of the rivers under the Embankments Act, but it was, even that was an admission of failure, that they could do anything about it. So they debated about it constantly. There's huge departmental discussions about what to do over 30, 40 years in the period that I've looked at. But they don't have a clear answer, and that's the problem. And so people agree that it's something they ought to do something about, but they felt there wasn't something that there wasn't a ready solution. On the question about modernisation, I think the word I use is travails, i.e. birth pains. I do believe there's something I'm not going to say that there's no difference between what we call modernity and what we call tradition. There are you can call it whatever you like. Modernity is the term we normally use. There are ways of organising life, ways of organising institutions, ways of seeing categories of people, ways of creating process, which are not 100%, but which are in significant ways different. And the difference here was the application of a science of engineers and agricultural scientists and bureaucrats with certain forms of record keeping and of laws with certain forms of precedent and courts. And those things were brought in for good or ill, and they were brought into a society which they did not perfectly match. And they had certain assumptions which conflicted. And that's what I call birth pains. I'm not denying there were many success stories, both on the technological side and, for that matter, on the scientific agriculture side, and on the political and legal side. No, I don't knock any of that. It all exists. But in the process of getting to where we are now, if you think about India today, it's an India which has been formed by those processes, and of course by things which were inherited. And even the inherited things are now expressed and interpreted in ways which we could regard as modern. So I don't deny that process at all, but there are losers as well as winners. There are painful processes during this. And what I'm describing in this period, and the book which I'm preparing about developmental efforts in Bihar, are mostly, or considerably, on the side of pain rather than benefit. I'm not being bold enough to say, hence the problems of Bihar subsequently, but there's some contributing factor there as well.
Thank you, Rob, for an excellent paper. Just to highlight that the contradictions of the British in India are quite important to note, and you delineated that quite beautifully in your paper, particularly the fact that it's not just about the variety of imperial agents who are out there, those wonderful engineers, those travelers, the surveyors and so on, who we all appreciate and whose records we sort of delve into and use, but also that they were constantly dealing with the fact that they had to thwart the short-term interests of capital in terms of the long-term security of the colonial state, which is why they had put into place those forest reserves, which is why they're putting into place canals. And there's a constant battle. So I think what we take away from your presentation is that these contradictions and these variety of imperial agents that make up the system, the nature of the state, and which is why we constantly come back to see why was India the center of the Indian Ocean world? Precisely because these engineers then traveled to Nigeria, to Kenya, and built, all these foresters travel to parts of Africa. So there's a shared intellectual elite of colonial experts. And I think a history that has been delineated by Richard Grove in Green Imperialism. And I think that in many ways we hark back to the empire. And I thank you for...
Well, not only those places, but places like New Zealand, where I come from.
Yeah.
The Indian engineers went off there and showed them how to create their railways and other things. So yes, indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.